In every conflict zone, there are visible front lines and invisible ones. The visible lines are uniforms and flags. The invisible lines are architecture, command, logistics, intelligence, and the small teams asked to do the hardest things quietly. Today, we go inside that architecture and ask what truly makes a society safer. I am Halima Abdulra'uf, and welcome to our first unofficial Spotlight On program that will explore how special operations work around the world and what that means for Nigeria's fight against insurgency and banditry. Since 2009, conflicts in the Lake Chad region has displaced about 2.1 million people, most in Nigeria's northeast. In the northwest, criminal armed groups and mass abductions have transformed daily life. Kidnapping-related events surged in recent years, making the region the epicenter of abductions. Government and communities are adapting, but threats evolve. In 2025, officials warned of renewed militant pressure in Borno. The response now rests heavily on intelligence, partnerships, and protection of civilians. Our guide tonight serves at the soldier's edge and now tells human stories from the camera's side. John Costa is an educationist, filmmaker, documentarian, and the lead consultant for S24 Media Services. Before the camera, there was the British Army uniform from 1985 to 1990, the late Cold War years that shaped modern special operations doctrine. John, welcome to the show.
Thank you very much.
Now let's delve into the main deal of the day. Let's define terms, what we say military architecture means. What are the load-bearing pillars?
Well, what you tend to find now is that post-Cold War, sort of post 9/11. So since 2001 now, we're into sort of 24 years of looking at terrorism, counterinsurgency being much more high profile than it would have been in the Cold War years. I mean, from a British military perspective, obviously we had the troubles in Northern Ireland, so we'd be dealing with the elements there on both sides, the loyalists and the Republicans. But since 9/11, we've had to revisit our infrastructure as well and the impact that has on our special forces. And also, I think, due to the global reach of some of these forces now that are needed to combat insurgencies on a global scale, that suddenly small units of 100 or 200 people are no longer enough. So we're having to share some of their resources, but also share some of their responsibilities with other units, and then look to redesignate certain units to be a little bit more specialist and coming under that sort of elite forces. So suddenly there's more options for someone moving from the British military into elite forces.
Okay. Now, around the world, special operations sit inside joint commands. The US USOCOM centralizes development and employment of SOF across services. The UK UKSF Directorate aligns SAS, SBS, SRR, and support units. France's COS brings Army, Navy, and Air and Space Special Forces under one operational authority. John, at an advanced level, note tactics, what differentiates special operations from conventional units, especially considering the today architecture of the security around the globe?
Yeah, I mean, if you look at it from our perspective in very broad terms, obviously, you know, the war in Ukraine at the moment, it means that suddenly there's sort of 6 NATO battle groups that operate in Romania and sort of various other countries that draws units that are very similar to how we used to have the British Army of the Rhine with a sort of a force that was there all the time. Suddenly they're away for 6 months at a time. So suddenly conventional forces are being used more now in those areas in case there are conflicts that are happening. And what that then does is put pressure on a global perspective on our other additional special forces units. Now, you mentioned obviously the Americans there and the British and the French. Well, of course, what we've found since 9/11 and the sort of coalition of the willing, as President George Bush called it, is that more and more countries have had to develop their special forces capabilities with the support of the countries that you mentioned there, like America, Britain and France. So what you find now is that a lot of countries that people wouldn't consider to have special military forces are highly equipped, are highly trained, and that's really where the Nigerian Special Forces come in.
So doctrine varies, but the core is consistent. Small joint intelligence led under firm political oversight. What French doctrine calls operation below thresholds with strategic effects. Then we would not like to localize this. You're well read. From your pools of knowledge and experience, what does Nigeria have and what's evolving, especially considering the Lake Chad region?
Well, it's fascinating really, because what you find now is, when you go looking for it, or you read between the lines, or you read the right kind of media, you find that the Nigerian Special Forces can hold their own when it comes to collaborating with the UK and the US on exercises. For example, there's a well-known Nigerian documentary about it as well. And what you're finding now is that with that small unit doctrine of, where the SAS, when it first founded, it was sort of small units of 10 men, now as sort of 4-man units, you're finding that those things are evolving into being different size forces with different roles and different responsibilities. So from a Nigerian perspective, you've got the Nigerian Army Special Operations Command, and 3 specific things that operate under that. You've got the 72nd Special Forces Battalion, which is kind of, highly motivated, highly trained, very difficult to get into, and quite rightly sees itself as a cut above the rest of the Nigerian Special Forces. And then you've got the Nigerian Navy with its Special Boat Service, SBS, very much modelled, I should imagine, on the Royal Marines of the United Kingdom, and they have a special responsibility for the oil rigs that are out in the sea there. And then you've got the new sort of the Special Operations Force from the federal government. There's sort of 800 people that already they've recruited out of 2,400 that they're looking to recruit, with a view to counter-terrorism operations and sort of hostage rescue and sort of generally combat against terrorists that are in the north. And I think what's really fascinating at the moment is that the Western media's eyes have gone off the Middle East, with Syria and Iraq, claiming that, IS, Islamic State, has been defeated, and that, their need to have, or their desired state to have a Islamic State has gone. The caliphate has gone. Well, of course it hasn't. What you find is that it's actually moved, it's evolved, it's moved itself into the Sahel, and it's representing itself in different ways in various countries. Now, if you were to look at the mainstream media as well in the West, you'll find that Islamic State and its affiliates are particularly active in Mozambique. So at the moment, the view is on sort of the east of Africa, Kenya as well in the north with Somalia, and sort of, Al-Shabaab. So it's got its lens over there, and people aren't really looking at West Africa and the Sahel. What they're thinking about is the French being thrown out of their former colonies, getting rid of the money, getting rid of the French language. A lot of that is about that kind of post-coup relationship, and where that sits with, we're taking our own responsibility back for our safety against the insurgency in the Sahel. That you've got the former British colony of Ghana, obviously not too far away from Nigeria. What impact is that going to have on tourism and that kind of, I think it's the oldest democratic place in West Africa as well. So then you've got, well, in Nigeria, it's quite interesting because where we are in the Nigerian north, of course, is bearing the brunt of the insurgency that's pushing down. Boko Haram, very well known, the Chibok girls, everybody would know about that in the Western media. So on these communities, there's a lot of pressure on them to, face the fight or be the front that supports it. But what we really need from the southern states is to realise that the north is the buffer between them and these people making any kind of headroad into Nigeria. So I think we really need to be revisiting not only maybe some of the tactics, but maybe sharing some of the tactics of what the federal government's doing with its forces to allay the fear of the people maybe in the south, but also in the north. But also looking at that well-known phrase, hearts and minds, which is, supporting people in the north to be able to be supportive of what the Nigerian forces are trying to do. It was fascinating in a recent interview that both you and I did with an NGO here,
Yes.
saying that actually they've seen that they're unable, over the last year, 18 months, have been able to not return to certain communities, not necessarily because of the insurgency taking those villages, but banditry and all of the other things that go with people that are involved in those things means that those communities are being lost to them. Well, of course, we're losing women and children that are vulnerable, and people are dying.
What do you think should matter most for Nigeria? I mean, from your experience in the battlefield, and then documenting stories of the underserved as a documentarian and educationist perspective.
For me, with my experience, luckily that didn't involve any kind of active combat, so that's quite a lucky thing, really, from my perspective, is the fact that lots of people that I've spoken to, that I've interviewed, and that I know, it always comes down to the heavy load is being bared by local forces, whether that's special forces or armed forces, and we really need to acknowledge that it's not Nigeria's fight against the insurgency. There's lots of other people that need to be involved, and obviously the way the American foreign policy is now about withdrawing from a lot of places and stuff, and if Nigeria is losing the drone support that came from French forces or American forces, then we need to be thinking about that sort of high level intelligence and movements. But then down on the ground as well, it's fascinating doing some research for this interview in sort of Somalia, where in the Puntland area, where sort of an equipped militia has been making some quite big gains against the local insurgents and stuff, and it was one of those rare stories of success about retaking areas from the insurgency. So I think what we really need to be thinking about is how we can get the regular forces, not just the special forces of the Nigerian military, to be able to work with the local population in a way that's built on trust. So again, we've got a long history of issues there that we need to overcome in order for this collective front to be presented, to be able to push that back. I mean, the British have a history in Malaya back in the 50s of putting people into compounds and then creating militias in there that kind of protected themselves against the communist insurgents. So, through history, as always, there are lessons that are there, and we can either choose to use them and think about how we can adapt them today. Because at the end of the day, I think, the insurgency and its movement down and what it's looking to do, and, its insatiable need to consume people and communities and the way it looks to operate, that it's a clear and present danger. And if we don't address it at some point, it will present itself on our door. And from Abuja to Kaduna isn't very far, and then from Kaduna to the northern border isn't very far as well. So it's here really in all sense and purposes, because preparing to come to Nigeria for this visit, people were saying to me about the security situation, what it's like and all that. A lot of it is misinformed because they're hearing snippets of it and stuff, and they don't do their research and they don't understand. So, it's like anything, going anywhere is a calculated risk. But if Nigeria is looking to attract the story we were discussing the other day about, is Nigeria the new place for sort of, adventure tourism because of its fantastic countryside and stuff, and mountains and rivers and stuff. Well, that will only become relevant and effective if there's security for people to come and visit. And as we're seeing in places like Kashmir, where once there's one terrorist event, it wipes out a tourist industry, then we really need to be thinking about, if we're going to attract investment, how do we keep it? And it will only stay if they feel secure.
In recent time, a former army chief said the COVID-19 kind of lockdown would solve insecurity problems in northern Nigeria. And by extension, whatever affects the northern part of Nigeria, it affects other regions, because the northern part of Nigeria, some states are like the food basket of the nation. What do you think about deploying COVID type of lockdown to combat insurgency and banditry in northern Nigeria?
Well, I guess referring to something I just said a moment ago about Malaya and the way the British kind of got people together, and they brought various villages and compounds together, created one place, gave them the means to secure themselves, which then meant that anybody that was moving in between those compounds, you would naturally assume would be a combatant. I think it's like anything, there's no one answer. And I think with a community like the North, but also with a country like Nigeria that is made up of lots of different areas and people and tribes and different beliefs and things like that, that there is no federal government way of saying this is the way that you should do it. I should think it should be devolved down to local people to make that decision, because what would work in the North wouldn't necessarily work in the Southeast. as much as it wouldn't in the UK if we were looking to defend ourselves. What would work in Scotland wouldn't necessarily work in Cornwall in the southwest. So it's very easy, I think, when you look at it from a global northwestern media perspective or even military perspective, to turn around and say, this is what Nigeria should do. Well, that's like saying this is what America should do when the issue's in Florida. You know, everywhere's different, and we need to take into account local conditions, local issues, you know, and also, you know, what existing systems are there already at that local community level that actually you could resource correctly, expand on, provide some training that would automatically make the insurgency not of interest to particularly, you know, unemployed young men.
Thank you. So 2025 saw warnings of Borno area pressure, and in the Northwest, mass casualty raids and kidnappings, including recent attacks in Katsina State, were the talk of the day. This pattern show why purely kinetic responses are not enough without governance and community trust. What is your take in this regard? Kinetic, non-kinetic, or combination of all of them?
Yeah, I think it's a combination that fits where it is. I mean, it's been proven, hasn't it? I think, you know, if we look at Afghanistan and we look at Iraq, that, you know, trying to bomb someone back to the Stone Age is not the answer. I think if you look back to Iraq and Afghanistan, it's been proved now many times in different conflicts that, you know, bombing people back to the Stone Age is not going to stop them. You know, that kind of terminology, which is using overwhelming force and technology, is not the answer. It's got to be winning the hearts and minds of the people on the ground, because as soon as you remove access to food, support, places they can leave weapons and things like that, you know, it suddenly makes you realise that there has to be some sort of coordinated approach that must come from a local level. It might be led by the federal government, but, you know, it can't just be the deployment of aircraft or you know, armored vehicles. It has to come with, you know, taking and holding ground and making sure that, you know, we deny, as America saw in Vietnam, you know, sort of having fire bases. You know, the Viet Cong, and it's been proven since with all the evidence that the Viet Cong could just move at will. So they weren't holding any ground at all. So all the lessons of history, as someone who does heritage and does a lot of conflict memory education, you realise that all of the answers to a lot of the problems that we have now have always been there. They've always seen, they operate in the same way. Is, are we willing to learn that lesson when we want to be doing is being seen to be tough?
So you filmed with people who carry these wars back to their family, kind of. Any moment that stayed with you as a documentarian?
Sometimes it's the impact of non-combatants as well as combatants, because obviously combatants have that moment. They come back and then relive that moment. And I think we're a lot more aware now of PTSD, post-traumatic stress syndrome, as we were. Remember, you know, 100 years ago in World War I, we were shooting people for cowardice that we now know was PTSD. And then the impact on non-combatants, I think, we're not really aware of. You know, where I'm from in Leicester, we have people from Syria, we have people that have come from Afghanistan, we've had people from Chechnya that I know and that I talk to and I support, particularly journalists. And what you find is that they've all experienced some kind of trauma. Sometimes the trauma on their journey to safety is as traumatic as what they've been through in the combat setting. But the one story that really stands out for me, and I think is the one lesson that I always think of whenever I'm thinking of anything, was an American documentary filmmaker that I know who was writing a book about the Second Chechen Wars, and he wanted to write about a specific battle. And he said he arranged to speak to 15 members of the Soviet forces and 15 of the Chechen freedom fighters. So who you're talking to, the invader or the Cheverist. So it was interesting. He said, so he had these 30 people, and before he interviewed each of them, he got out a map of the battle and asked them to point out on it where they were. He said, so he's got this map with, like, you know, 30 red dots on it of where these people were. And he got 30 different versions of that battle from 15 people on both sides. So if you not start adding in other people that aren't there but are in command, back in a command bunker, people that are on the left and the right that are hearing what's going on, and then you add in civilians, invariably are impacted the non-combatants. You've got one incident that's recorded in the mainstream media. This happened this is who were involved, this is how many died, this is when it ended. You've got 1,000 stories about one battle that will never get recorded, that will never get known, but that could add to the narrative of what happened. And history and the mainstream media is all about facts and figures and what happened and who did what. Whereas actually, I think community media, conflict memory, and what we're looking to do with S24 media services and S24 television is to find out what's going on the ground, on the border of the Sahel with the insurgency, and make sure that we're finding out about what the Nigerian forces are up to, but also what the local communities and people that are arriving from those areas that have been impacted and have been taken, what their experience is, because what they tell us will be how we can shape our coverage of what's going on, and making sure we're asking the right questions.
Oh, that's really robust. And I think the key takeaways for me is trying to bring down to the point of PTSD for non-combatant or even combatants, bringing the conflict memory back to their family, which is can be more traumatizing for anyone, because I see maybe in about 100 years ago when you mentioned, so PTSD was seen as cowardice, and now people understand better, and I think that would go a long way in sorting a lot of things for people in the battlefield. I would say today's lesson is simple. If tough, architecture without humanity collapses, and humanity without architecture is undefended. The societies that reconcile both are the one that heal in the long term. So thank you so much for joining this, Mr. John. I know that it's an in-house thing, but it's a very good conversation to talk about, especially with the situation in Nigeria in terms of security. The government is trying, the people are trying, but it seems the problem is not going away anytime soon. So it means there is need for re-strategizing to bring an end to this or bring it to the barest minimum. Thank you so much for joining.
Thank you.
All right, that's it on Spotlight On for S24 Television. See you around again next time. Thank you. Bye for now.